Alright everybody, welcome to my second video on the Nikon F3. We're going to jump right into how to do stuff with this camera. First thing is this has an electronically controlled shutter, so unless you're going to rely strictly on the backup shutter release, we need to have batteries in here, otherwise we're not going to be able to do anything with this camera. To remove the battery cap, we're just going to grab a nickel or other coin and unscrew it, and it should unscrew very easily. Now, as you should be able to see, this camera uses two 357 type batteries. There we go. And those are also called AG13, A76, S76, LR44. There's also a version of this battery, I forget the designation of, that's the size of two of these, and you can use those as well. If we look on the little plastic clip for the battery cap, you can see that there's a guide to show you how to orient the batteries and to indicate that you need 1.5 volt batteries, which is to say, don't use 675 batteries because they won't give you a proper meter reading. The battery cap will simply thread back into the battery chamber like this. We're just going to drop it in place, and then it should thread very easily just by turning whatever coin you've used. If it puts up resistance, you want to back it out and try again, because the threads should get into the raceways very easily. If you are fighting against this, you're probably cross-threading it, and that's a really good way to ruin either your battery cap or the bottom of your camera. And while they could both either or be replaced, it's always a better idea not to have to replace something than to have to replace it. Alright, so the next thing we're going to do is replace a lens. We have a battery in the camera, so we can start taking pictures, but we have no, well, there's a lens on it, but let's pretend we need to put a lens on it. I'm going to first go over how to mount an AI lens and then an NAI lens, and then we'll talk a little bit later about how to meter with an NAI. We'll talk about it now, whatever. Okay, to remove a lens, we're just going to push the lens release button there and rotate clockwise until we can't rotate anymore. And then we can just take the lens off the camera body. To mount the lens, for an AI lens, we're going to look for either a black index dot right there, or some of them don't have that, and you just use the focusing line for your focus point, and that lines up with the white dot on the body of the camera. Just put it in, then we're going to rotate it counter or anti-clockwise until it clicks into place. And we've mounted an AI lens. Okay, but we want to use an NAI lens. So as you can see here with the AI lens, by the nostrils on it, right here, you can see there's a little cutout. This NAI lens does not have that same cutout. So if we just mount this NAI lens right now, we're going to risk damaging the camera. This cutout engages with this connection right here. Right. And so we've got to get that connection out of the way in order to mount an NAI lens. We'll push that little silver button that's next to the film index, or the lens mounting index, down in towards the camera, and now we can flip this connection pin up and out of the way. With that out of the way, we just mount this lens exactly like we did the previous and click it into place. And you might be able to see there that if we were to click that down right now, we would still risk damaging that coupling. If you damage that coupling, your camera will not be able to meter properly, and all of your metering will be done exactly as I'm about to show you with stop-down metering. So we've mounted an NAI lens, but how are we actually going to use it? That coupling lever that we just put out of the way, what that does is when an AI lens is mounted and we adjust the aperture ring, that lever interfaces with this little shelf, or whatever you want to call it, right here, and that allows the lens to understand what aperture, it allows the camera to understand what aperture the lens is set at and determine a proper meter reading. The way that a meter works in an SLR like this is that light comes through the lens when it's wide open. That's exactly how it's supposed to work. And then as the aperture ring changes, that information is communicated to the camera's light meter, so the camera knows I'm seeing light at f1.4, but the setting is actually f5.6. So I need to have the shutter speed be some amount faster to get a proper exposure with this much with this much light reduction. With an NAI lens and this flipped out of the way, the camera will still stop this lens down to f5.6. Right? Let's find out. I'm on bulb mode. Well, it did. I'm actually kind of surprised because this lens also has oily blades. Anyway, it does, when it takes the photo, stop the aperture down to the selected setting. However, because the aperture information hasn't been conveyed to the camera, it thinks it's going to have f1.4. So, in order to meter with the camera, we have to do what's called stop-down metering. There's two ways to use depth of field metering with this camera. I'm going to show you first how to do it in automatic mode, okay, with your shutter dial set to A. We're going to set the aperture to what we want it to be. Let's say f5.6. We're going to push the silver button down, which will close the aperture. All right, so now the aperture's shut to f5.6. We're going to push and hold the exposure memory button like that, so the camera is now remembering what shutter speed it needs in automatic mode with f5.6. And then we take our photo, and then we can release it. And that's how we do stop-down metering with this camera with an NAI lens in automatic mode. Okay, great, but I don't want to use automatic mode. I want to use manual mode. That's just fine. What we're going to do is we're going to hold down the silver button for depth of field preview metering, and then we're going to adjust the shutter speed dial until we get to the shutter speed that gives us a proper exposure, and then we'll take our photo. That's just as good a way to do it. So there are a couple of different ways to do stop-down metering with this lens, or with any NAI lens. The big thing to remember when you use an NAI lens is mount it properly and do stop-down metering. Another thing that's important to remember is that older light meters are less accurate as the lens is stopped down. So until f8, the light meter on this will be pretty accurate. But when you get to f11, you're going to likely get underexposure, even with the method I just showed you. And at f22, you're going to get a lot of underexposure. So my general guide that I use for stop-down metering with NAI lenses, starting at f11, is add around about a half stop of added exposure. Film's really tolerant, especially color negative and black and white. So if you wanted, since this is in third stops, you can add 2/3 of a stop for each stop. So we're at f11. We're going to need to tell the meter to give us 2/3 more stop, 2/3 more light. We're at f16. We're going to need 1 1/3. We're at f22. We're going to need 2 stops. You could do 1/3 of a stop, whatever. The big point here is that as you stop down past f8, you need to throw more light at the film because the light meter is going to be less accurate. So you're tricking the camera into giving you a closer to proper exposure with your reading. This is only in automatic mode. If you're using a manual shutter speed, just take a meter reading off f8. If you're going to shoot at f16, add 2 more stops of light manually, and you'll be just fine. To remove an NAI lens, just push the button down and remove it the exact same way. We're going to put our AI lens back on. So we're going to flip the coupling pin back into position, and now we're going to mount our lens. If you forgot to flip the coupling pin back into position before mounting your AI lens, take the lens off and then flip the coupling pin back into place, because if you try to flip it back into place with this lens mounted, you will very possibly damage your coupling pin. We've got batteries, we've got lenses, and we've seen how to do those. Let's talk about how to load film into this camera so we can actually take some real photos. First thing I'm going to do is set this to a manual shutter speed of 1/2000th. All right, we're going to open up the back of the camera first. Unlock the film back release rather, lift, and open the back of the camera. We're going to grab our 35mm film and drop it into the cassette chamber right here. And once the film is in place, we're going to push the film rewind knob back in so that it holds the film cassette in place. We're going to take our film leader, we're going to slide it into one of these slots on the take-up spool. We're going to put our fingers right over the sprocket holes right there, and just lightly, just a little bit of pressure, don't push it down, and then we're going to advance a frame. That's looking pretty good to me. I'm going to trust that this is working. Next thing we're going to do is take any slack out of the film by rewinding the film rewind knob knob and lever in the direction of the arrow. And then we're going to advance 3 frames. And you can see that this is moving, right? This moving tells us that the film is moving through the camera in a proper fashion. That's why we take the slack out of it, so that this movement gives us confirmation that we have done our job correctly. Okay, now we're going to change the film's speed. ISO and ASA are exactly the same, so this ring is going to be marked ASA, if it's marked at all. But ISO is the same number. 400 ISO film is 400 ASA. To adjust the film speed, we simply lift and rotate until we get to the speed that we want to use. We're actually using 400 ISO films, so I'm just going to put it back and leave it at 400 ISO. This will tell the camera how to properly meter for the type of film that we have in it. The camera only needs to know the film speed. It doesn't care whether it's slide, color, or black and white film. So the way that film works is that film is one and done. You take photos, you can see this is advancing still. You take a photo and you advance the film here, and film that was in the cassette is pulled out of the cassette and across the back of the camera. Film can record light a single time, and if you use it in a camera with a proper aperture and shutter speed and ISO setting and you have good lighting, then you'll get a proper exposure. Or you can expose your film to light this way, in which it will record every photon, absorb every photon that it can until it is instantaneously, this happens, completely ruined. If you open your film back when your film is in your camera like this, everything that is outside of your film cassette will be erased to every photo that it has taken or could potentially take in the future. But I want you to see how film works inside of a camera when you take a photo. So I'm going to take a photo and advance the film. And as you can see, as I advance the film, it physically moves through the back of the camera. And those lines should give you some help to see that exactly. So the film moves, and fresh film that was in the cassette is pulled into the area in front of the shutter right here. And that's how the film records an image. Okay, so what happens when you're done with your roll of film? You've taken all of your photos. I'm gonna push the film rewind release down. Did not mean to accidentally push the shutter at the same time, but it doesn't matter. Push the film rewind release down on the bottom. And now we'll just start rewinding. When you get to the end, you're going to hear a sound, and this is usually audible outside of the camera. Just like that. And then you just keep rewinding. And at this point, you rewind your film all the way into the cassette. Now you can open your camera back. The film has been rewound safely, and the camera back can be opened. We'll remove the film rewind knob, and this has gotten increasingly hard to pull with my leader retriever, so I'm going to leave this out. But you want to try to rewind your film all the way into the cassette. That way you don't accidentally use this again and take double exposures over your photos. So you can either at this point put your next roll of film in and continue shooting for the day, or if you are done, close that up, trigger your shutter to take any tension off of the springs, close up your camera, lock it, and you are good to go to set this off to the side until your next shoot. Okay, so we've seen we're starting to get underway with how to use this camera. Next thing we're going to talk about is some flash photography basics. All right, so if you have the hot shoe adapter here, you can put your flash onto this connection here. I don't have it. We'll play a little bit of make-believe though. The other thing you can do is use what's called a flash PC port. It stands for Pronter Compor, and that is an old-timey leaf shutter. They developed this standard sort of flash trigger port, which uses a flash cable that looks like this, that just plugs right into this port here, and then this cable can plug into some cameras. Also, there are adapters and things like that that work. So those are the two ways of connecting a flash to your camera, either through this PC port or through an adapter that fits over your rewind knob. So the way that this camera works for flash, the most reliable way to do it, is to plan on using your flash with manual power calculations. That's how this was developed to be used. There's no automatic flash triggering with this camera, at least not that I'm aware of. So what you want to do for your flash is set your shutter speed to X. This is your flash sync speed. You can also use anything longer then from 1/60th and slower as well. So X and then 1/60th here on orange, back to time. Flash will work with all of those, okay? With time, will it work with time? I think it does. Anyway, have not personally tried. With X, your sync speed and your shutter speed is 1/180th of a second. You can use X without a flash to get a 1/180th of a second shutter speed, by the way. But with X, this is where you would connect the flash, generally speaking. Now, this is the fastest shutter speed that you can use a flash with. So why is that? Well, let's pretend that you're about to take a photo, and this is what you're going to take a photo of, and you need a flash. When you take a photo, the first curtain in front of the film opens, and then the second one closes, and when you advance the film, they reset like that. Okay, so if you're at 1/80th of a second, the first curtain opens, everything on the film is exposed to light for about 1/80th of a second, curtain closes, reset. What if you're at 4 seconds? Well, same basic process. Curtain opens, 4 seconds of light on the film, curtain closes, reset. What if you're at 1/500th of a second? Curtain opens, second curtain follows behind it, and then when you advance the film, they reset. So with the faster shutter speeds, they're not controlled by the curtains moving faster, they're controlled by the gap between the curtains. So if you think about 4 seconds, that's just a 4-second gap between the curtains. If you think about 1/500th, that's just a 1/500th of a second gap between the curtains. Okay, so if you were to trigger your flash at 1/500th of a second, you would just have a little strip of light that's illuminated off to the side of one of your images, and it would tell you how thick the gap is at 1/500th of a second with your shutter curtains. But you would not get a fully exposed flash photo because the curtain would block the majority of your frame. Okay, so that understood, let's talk about some basic flash tips. Now, you would generally be speaking, if you mount the flash, mount it right here. This is almost the worst possible place you can mount a flash. The reason that is that if you mount a flash on top of your camera and it triggers, you're going to get this wave of light that reaches your subjects, bounces back to your lens, and then onto your film. That flat light will be replicated as a flat and waxy look to your subjects, and also, if you're using color film, red eye. Not a good look. Even having your flash over here to the side like this, same basic thing. So there are a couple of ways you can mitigate that. You can put your flash there, but get one that has an articulating head so that you can bounce your flash off of the ceiling. Why would you do that? Well, think about the way that we see everything, whether we're outside under the sun, indoors under overhead lighting. We're underneath lighting. Human brains are wired to see what's lit from above as being normal and flattering. So if you're inside of a space and you bounce the flash off the ceiling, then you're replicating that light. That beam of light, that wave of light hits the ceiling, and then it scatters evenly from the ceiling, and you also have a softer, more flattering light that is also coming from above. You can also get flashes if you don't have a ceiling overhead that tilt to the side. So they are rotating and actually it's tilting when it goes up and down and rotating when it goes left and right. So you can tilt your flash head up and down, and then rotate your head to your flash head to the side to bounce off of a wall and replicate that bounce flash lighting to an extent as well. So that's a really good way to do it. Since you have a PC port on the camera here that you can use a cable with, you can also get something called a flash bar. This would screw into the bottom of your camera, and then there are little adapters that allow your flash to screw into it as well. And now if you're shooting in portrait mode, you can point your flash at the ceiling, okay, or in landscape mode at the wall, okay. So this gives you some options as well for holding your flash off to the side for your flash photography. So those are just some basic tips about how to get the most out of your flash when you use it with the Nikon F3. Next thing we're going to do is talk about how to swap out the Prism on the F3. So the way I'm going to show you to remove it does apply to the HP Prism because that's what I've got. But there's There are grips on either side of it, right here. What we're going to do is we're going to push them backwards, and then this should just pop right off. Push them backwards and lift up. How does this... I don't do this very often. There we go. Push them backwards and lift up. Okay, and that's how we remove the prism. So if we have a different prism, now we can put it onto the camera. While we have the prism off, we have access to the focusing screen. With the focusing screen, I'm just going to put my thumbnail right here and lift it up and pull it out of the camera. Okay, so the motion for that was, if it's in the camera, put your nail underneath it, just pry it up a little bit, grab the sides of it and pull it out. You don't want to touch the top and bottom of the focusing screen because you don't want to get your fingerprints on there, because you can only clean this with distilled water. It's really an absolute pain to clean these if they get super dirty. You can pretty quickly get some dust, like I have on this one, off just with a gentle brush or a bulb blaster. Now we're going to grab a different focusing screen. We're going to put it in. The movement is exactly the opposite. We're going to angle it into the camera this way, drop it so that that pin that's at the front is on top of that little notch, and if we do our job correctly, it just slides and clicks right into place like that. Okay. If we have to clean the prism, we can do that right now exactly the same way you should clean the front of a lens. Now we're going to take our prism, we're going to start sliding it back into place, and we do the exact opposite motion that we did to take the prism off. We push these backwards and then release them once the prism is seated, and that looks good and it feels good. We've taken off the prism, replaced it, and also had the opportunity to swap out the focusing screen on the camera. Next thing we're going to do is take a look at what you will see through the viewfinder of the camera as you are using it. And for that, I've got this handy dandy little printout. So when you go to take photos, you're going to look through the viewfinder and you're going to see this. An absolutely delightful focusing screen, I'm not going to lie, because it's very minimal. Over here, we have your shutter speed, your aperture. This is an electronic display in your viewfinder. In my camera, at least, and I've heard this is a fairly common issue, mine just displays 85 unless it's very warm outside, and then it magically starts working again. Then this is projecting the aperture from your lens's aperture ring into a window here using a mirror at the front of your camera. So as you adjust your aperture, this is going to be adjusted. As you adjust your shutter speed, this will be adjusted if you're in manual mode. If you're in automatic mode, this will tell you what your shutter speed's going to be. In manual mode, there's a little M here that will be illuminated, and that plus or minus will tell you whether or not you are over or underexposed in manual mode, or whether or not you are using overexposure or underexposure compensation in automatic mode. Really, that's all the information a focusing screen and viewfinder need to give you, and that's exactly what this does. So when it comes to actually using your viewfinder, the default screen is going to be this split prism. If you grab a scene, let's say you have a building, okay? You got a photo of a building. If you find a straight wall in the building, a vertical, and the two lines of the vertical are misaligned here, it will be out of focus. But if you focus and you bring these together so that they form a straight line, now everything where that's a straight line will be in focus. So you use a split prism by trying to find something vertical and bringing it into a straight line like that. And then you've got the rest of your building right there, okay? And a person standing next to it or something like that. Yay, hooray, person. Okay, and that's how you use your split prism. Other viewfinders, or focusing screens rather, work a little bit differently. I have the grid focusing screen in mine, which shows a grid, no split prism. I'm not a particular fan of split prisms. I don't know, it's just personal preference. But some of them, there are many, like I said, there are 15 different options. So if you don't like the split prism, there are other options you can get as well. There's a plain matte screen, delight to use. No grid, no prism, just an even matte screen. Really nice and undistracting photographic experience. So anyway, that's what the viewfinder information is. That's how to read it and how to use it. One last note, when you're using this in manual mode, I forgot to mention this, a proper exposure in manual mode shows both the plus and the minus. Next thing we're going to talk about is how to properly use the time exposure with the Nikon F3. This is one you want to get right, especially if you're doing something like an overnight star trails photo, so that you don't completely drain your battery and come out the next morning to a dead battery, or also even if you're just doing waterfall photos, so that you don't drain your battery prematurely doing those. So we're going to set the shutter speed to T, just like that. And now, the way that this works is if you push the shutter button, the shutter is now open, and it will remain open until you adjust the shutter speed dial away from T. That differs from bulb. With bulb, the shutter will be open as long as you hold the shutter button down, but if you release it, it will close. Personally, I prefer T. It's, I think, a much more preferential shutter speed. I don't even know why they have both T and B on this. But anyway, to use T, that's what you do, except what you can do is you can use the mechanical backup release instead of the shutter button. So if you're going to use T, this will help preserve your battery. Pop this down, start your time exposure. Nope, doesn't turn off that way. Turn it off at the shutter speed dial. And that will give you more battery life than it will if you use your shutter release up here. So we've done almost everything this camera can do. Let's talk now about how to actually take a photo with this camera. So in automatic mode, it's really easy. You set the dial, the shutter speed dial, to A. We're going to select the aperture that we want to use. This one looks good. We're going to dial in the focus as we want, looking through the viewfinder, of course. We're going to select our focus and compose our scene. We're going to take a photo, just like that. Really simple to do. Okay, what if we're using manual mode? Well, we talked about how to meter in manual mode just a couple of minutes ago. So we're going to obtain a proper meter reading where the plus and the minus are both visible above the shutter speed for our selected aperture. Okay, we're going to look through the viewfinder, get focus, and take a photo. Okay, really good. Taking a single photo is pretty simple, and it's just a matter of what type of mode you want to use to do that. Actually, let's go back to 1/125th of a second. Okay, so photo's really easy. What about a double exposure? Really simple to do. I'm going to show you the mechanics of it, and then I'm going to explain the science of it. So the mechanics of it are pretty simple. We're going to take our first photo. We're going to flip the double exposure lever out, a bit awkward to do doing this with the wrong hand, and then we're going to advance the film advance lever until our finger gets in the way, move it, and now we have rearmed the shutter without advancing the film. We can take our second photo, and now we advance the film, and we can go on shooting the rest of the day. One of the beautiful things about having a double exposure lever here is that we don't need to take a dead frame after we've taken our double exposure. Okay, so that's the mechanics. How do we do this to get a proper exposure? Film is designed to have a certain number of photons reach it to give you a proper exposure. So let's assume that 1/125th at f5.6 is a single proper exposure, and you take that photo, and now you do your double exposure. The film has received twice as many photons as it was really designed to, and that's going to give you a negative which is called thick, dense, or dark. That's three words that mean the same thing. Your film has too many photons. The result of that when you get it back is that it's going to be physically darker than the other negatives. When you scan it, you'll end up with low contrast and high digital noise. If you print it in the darkroom, you'll end up with low contrast and long print times. Neither of those are great situations, so when you do a double exposure, you want to cut the amount of light from each exposure so that you get a single proper exposure when they're combined. So let's take a look here. We're at 1/125th and f5.6. First thing we're going to do is talk about how to do this in manual mode because it's really easy to understand. You have two parameters that you can adjust in manual mode to do this. The first is your shutter speed. If you want to cut the amount of light in half from your shutter speed, you go to, if you guessed 1/250th, you'd be correct. These are fractions. The higher the number, the faster the time. A 250th of a second is twice as fast, or half as much light, as a 125th of a second. So now we can go through our double exposure again. Okay, but let's say you have a half-second exposure, or a full second exposure, and you really want that full second because this is going to be a waterfall and you really want very, very blurry water. Well, the other thing you can do is with your aperture. You can adjust this, f5.6, and we're going to go to f8. f8 is f8. f8 is one stop slower than f5.6, which means half as much light. So you can cut the amount of light coming to your film either by adjusting your shutter speed or your aperture. And then you just go through the process that we showed mechanically, and that's how you do this in manual mode. Okay, but you're using my specific F3, and the LCD screen in it doesn't really work very well, so you don't know what a proper exposure in manual mode is going to be, so you're kind of locked into using it in automatic, which is aperture priority, which means we can't just change our aperture setting, we have to change the shutter speed somehow, but we're in automatic mode. That's where exposure compensation comes in. We're going to take two photos, each one needs to have one stop less light. We're going to turn this dial down to -1. That's going to force the camera to give us one stop less light by using the shutter speed when we take each of our double exposures. After we take our double exposures, then we just have to make sure we remember to turn that back to 0 so that the rest of the film doesn't come out underexposed. And that's how we do a double exposure with this camera. Now there is one last trick that I forgot to mention earlier, and I'm going to teach you how to use exposure memory for this camera. And what this means is, let's say you're sitting at a setting where you have a dark shade overhead, like you have a tree, a thick tree over you, and you're sitting with someone and then there's hills in the background. And you want to get them properly exposed. And you're in automatic mode in f5.6 or f whatever, it doesn't matter, f1.4, who cares. You're in automatic mode with your shutter set. If you just take a photo of them, then what's behind them is going to be properly exposed in theory, and especially if you have it framed where they're off to the side and then the field is over here. But they're going to be a dark shadow. We want to prevent that. So what we're going to do in automatic mode is we're going to take the image, and here is the scene that we want. We've got our tree right here, big tall cover here, lots and lots of shade. We've got our friend sitting right here with us, okay? And then here we've got a bunch of hills in the background. Bright sun, dark shade. Center of the focusing screen, this is where we're going to meter. So if we just compose this, like we want it to be, this is going to be properly exposed. Our friend's going to be a silhouette. So what we do is we have it in automatic mode. We select our aperture. We recompose the image so that our friend and the tree are in the center of the frame. And then we're going to hold down the exposure memory button. Then we recompose the image to get this scene, and then we take the photo. When we hold the exposure memory button down and we have this area in the center of the frame, what we're doing is telling the camera, this is the meter reading. Don't forget it as long as I press this button down. And then here's the image I want to take. I'm actually going to take it using this meter reading. If you're shooting manual mode, it's really simple. Just dial in your manual settings using your meter reading over here on this side of the image, and you're good to go. So the exposure memory button is something you only need to use in automatic mode, and only when you're using that type of setting or when you're using NAI lenses for stop-down metering. And that is it for the Nikon F3. Thank you everyone very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next camera review videos.